The suffocating heat of the African savanna shimmered in the air, distorting the golden, dry landscape. The sky, painted in a pale, cloudless blue, was relentless, and the few twisted trees cast barely enough shade to make a difference. It was an unbearably hot afternoon, and every living creature seemed to be struggling under the weight of the scorching sun. Atlas Monroe, a 30-year-old American conservationist, drove slowly along the dirt roads of the reserve where he had been working for the past 4 years. He had spent countless hours studying big cats, tracking their behavior, and fighting against poaching. But nothing had prepared him for what he saw that day. Lying in the middle of the path, collapsed onto the red dust and surrounded by eerie silence, was a lioness. Atlas slammed on the brakes, his heart hammering against his ribs. She wasn't moving. Her breathing was barely visible. Her body was painfully thin, her ribs pushing against her sunken skin. Her golden coat, which should have glowed under the sun, was dull and matted with dirt. Her half-closed eyes reflected nothing but exhaustion and pain. Slowly, Atlas stepped out of his jeep, his muscles tense. Even in such a weakened state, she was still a predator. But there was no threat in her, no strength left to fight. He crouched beside her, studying her fragile form. "You still with me, girl?" he murmured, his voice barely louder than the wind rustling through the dry grass. The lioness barely responded, just the faintest rise and fall of her chest. A slow, resigned blink. What had happened to her? Was she abandoned, injured, chased away from her pride? Atlas had seen starving lions before, but there was something different about her. She wasn't just dying from hunger. She had given up. He hurried back to his jeep, grabbing a canteen of water. Pouring a little into the lid, he carefully moved it close to her mouth. For a moment, he thought she was too weak to react. But then, her rough tongue flicked out, barely managing to lap up the water. Atlas swallowed hard. He couldn't just leave her here. If he walked away now, she wouldn't last the night. Taking a deep breath, he made a decision. "I'm not leaving you behind. I'll take care of you." What he didn't know was that this moment would change his fate in ways he could never imagine. Atlas knew the risks. Transporting a wild lioness, even one on the brink of death, was dangerous. But leaving her behind meant certain death. His heart pounded as he rushed back to his jeep, grabbing a thick tarp and a rope. He had to act fast. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the savanna. If night fell, scavengers would come. Hyenas, jackals, creatures that wouldn't hesitate to finish what starvation had already begun. He moved carefully, his voice low and steady. "All right, girl, I'm gonna help you. Just stay with me." The lioness barely reacted. Her breathing was slow, her body limp. Every second counted. Atlas spread the tarp beside her, kneeling down to assess her weight. She was emaciated, but still a full-grown lioness, easily over 250 pounds. His muscles tensed. This wasn't going to be easy. Digging his hands under her frail body, he heaved with all his strength. His back screamed in protest, his arms shaking as he dragged her inch by inch onto the tarp. The lioness let out a weak, pitiful groan, her head lolling to the side. "I know, girl. I know it hurts. Just hold on." Sweat dripped from his forehead as he finally got her onto the tarp. He tied the edges together, creating a makeshift stretcher. Now came the hardest part, lifting her into the jeep. Atlas took a deep breath, planted his feet, and pulled with everything he had. His muscles burned, his vision blurred with the strain. The weight was unbearable, but the thought of leaving her behind pushed him forward. With a final, desperate effort, he managed to hoist her onto the back of the jeep. He collapsed beside her, gasping for breath. She was still alive, but for how long? Atlas climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the deep rumble breaking the silence of the dying afternoon. He had only one destination in mind, his remote research outpost miles away from the nearest town. It wasn't a veterinary clinic, but it had supplies, food, water, shelter. As he sped across the rough terrain, dust rising behind him, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The lioness hadn't moved, A wave of doubt crashed over him. Was he too late? Then, as the jeep hit a bump, her eyes fluttered open, just for a moment. Atlas exhaled sharply. "You're still with me, girl. Just hold on. Just a little longer." What he didn't realize was that saving her life would soon put his own in danger. The jeep roared through the empty savanna, bouncing violently over the uneven dirt road. Atlas gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The sun had almost disappeared, leaving behind a burning red sky that slowly darkened into shades of violet and black. Every few seconds, he glanced at the lioness in the rearview mirror. She was still there, sprawled across the tarp, her body rising and falling in slow, shallow breaths. Her eyes remained closed, her head resting against the metal frame. She looked lifeless. Atlas clenched his jaw. "Come on, girl. Just a little longer." His research outpost was still miles away, tucked deep in the reserve. It wasn't much, just a small cabin with a radio, basic medical supplies, and enough provisions to last a few weeks. No veterinarians, no fancy equipment. If she had internal injuries, there was nothing he could do. But he had to try. As the sky turned pitch black, the first signs of danger appeared. In the distance, a pack of hyenas prowled along the road, their eerie laughter echoing through the open plains. Their noses were sharp, their hunger even sharper. Atlas pressed harder on the gas. The jeep rumbled past the scavengers, kicking up dust in its wake. The hyenas hesitated, their glowing eyes following the vehicle before they disappeared into the night. Atlas exhaled in relief, but it didn't last long. A deep, guttural growl came from the back of the jeep. It was weak, but unmistakable. He glanced over his shoulder. The lioness' eyes were open, but something had changed. Her breathing was heavier, her muscles twitched, and her amber gaze, once dull and lifeless, now burned with something else. Instinct. Atlas' stomach tightened. He had been so focused on saving her that he had ignored the reality of the situation. He was trapped in a confined space with an apex predator, a starving one. He slowed the jeep, heart pounding. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice steady but cautious. The lioness blinked, her ears twitching. Her body was still too weak to move, but the way she looked at him sent a chill down his spine. For the first time, he realized she didn't know him. To her, he was just another creature in the wild. Food. Atlas' pulse quickened. He needed to get to the outpost fast, before she regained enough strength to do what her instincts were telling her to do. He gripped the wheel and sped into the darkness, knowing that the real challenge had just begun. Atlas drove through the darkness, his pulse racing as the jeep bounced over the rugged dirt road. The research outpost was still miles away, and every second that passed, the tension in the vehicle grew thicker. The lioness was awake now, weak, but awake. Her heavy breathing filled the cabin, and every so often, he could hear the faintest growl deep in her throat. She wasn't aggressive, at least not yet, but she was watching him. Atlas kept his hands steady on the wheel, his mind racing through his options. He had no cage, no tranquilizers, nothing to protect himself if she suddenly decided he was a threat. Or worse, a meal. "Easy, girl," he murmured without looking back. His voice was low, calm, the way he would speak to a spooked animal. The lioness didn't respond. She just stared. Her ribs moved with every labored breath. She was still too weak to stand, but her instincts were waking up. She wasn't just a dying creature anymore. She was a predator remembering what she was. Atlas had worked with big cats for years, but never like this. Never this close. Never with one that didn't know who he was. Minutes stretched into eternity as he finally spotted the outline of the outpost in the distance. A small cabin, barely visible in the moonlight, surrounded by a makeshift fence. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. As he pulled up, the engine rumbled to a stop, and the silence that followed was deafening. Now came the hard part. He turned slowly, finally meeting her eyes. Up close, they were even more intense. Deep amber, filled with something unreadable. Not fear, not anger, just survival. Atlas reached for the tarp. "Let's get you inside," he whispered. He expected resistance, maybe even a snarl, but the lioness simply blinked, exhausted beyond fight or flight. Carefully, he slid his arms under her frail body, muscles straining as he lifted her. She was heavier than she looked, her limp form pressing against his chest. She let out a weak, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, but not a purr either. A warning, or maybe just a reminder that she was still there, still dangerous. Atlas carried her through the gate, past the small fenced-in area, and into the cabin. Inside, he had a small storage room lined with supplies, bags of dried meat for research, clean water, first aid kits. He laid her down on a thick blanket in the corner, stepping back cautiously. She didn't move. Her breathing was still shallow, her body still fragile. But she was watching him. Atlas grabbed a bowl and poured fresh water, sliding it carefully toward her. For a moment, she just stared. Then, slowly, she stretched her neck forward and began to drink. Atlas exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. It wasn't trust. Not yet, but it was a start. What he didn't know was that this fragile bond would soon be tested in ways he could never imagine. Atlas sat on the floor of the cabin, his back against the wall, watching the lioness in the dim glow of the lantern. The room was silent except for the rhythmic sound of her breathing and the occasional scrape of her rough tongue against the metal bowl as she drank. She was still weak, her body barely able to hold itself up, but there was something different now. Her eyes, once dull and lifeless, held a faint flicker of awareness. She was watching him just as much as he was watching her. For the first time, Atlas allowed himself to exhale. She had made it through the night. The relief was short-lived. He knew that keeping a wild lioness inside a small cabin wasn't sustainable. She was still too weak to be released, but every hour that passed, she would regain strength, and with it, her instincts. Atlas ran a hand through his dusty hair, his mind racing. He needed a plan. He couldn't call for help. The nearest ranger station was too far, and he had no way to transport her safely. He had to do this on his own. His first priority, food. Reaching into his supply stash, he pulled out a large slab of dried meat. It wasn't fresh, but it was better than nothing. He tore off a piece and, moving cautiously, placed it on the floor between them. The lioness barely reacted. Her ears twitched, nostrils flaring as she caught the scent, but she didn't move. Atlas frowned. Was she too weak? Or did she still not trust him? He sat back down, waiting. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, she stretched her front leg forward, claws barely grazing the floor. She dragged the meat toward her, her movements sluggish but determined. Atlas watched as she took her first bite. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The first step toward trust. Over the next few days, Atlas kept his routine the same. He gave her water. He left food close enough for her to take without feeling threatened. He moved carefully, never making sudden gestures. At first, she barely acknowledged him. But by the third day, something changed. As he set the bowl of water down, he felt it. The weight of her gaze, more intense than before. When he looked up, their eyes met. And this time, she didn't look away. Atlas felt something stir in his chest. She was starting to see him as something other than a threat. Not quite as a friend. Not yet. But maybe something in between. He knew that trust with a wild animal was never guaranteed. It was fragile, temporary, and could shatter at any moment. But for now, in the quiet space of that cabin, a bond was beginning to form. And soon, that bond would be put to the ultimate test. Atlas woke up to an unusual sound inside the cabin. At first, he wasn't sure if he had imagined it, but then he heard it again. A faint scraping against the wooden floor. His senses sharpened instantly, and he turned his head toward the lioness. She was moving. For days, she had barely been able to lift her head, her body too weak to do anything but breathe. But now she was trying to stand, her front legs pushed against the floor, muscles shaking as she struggled to support her own weight. Her back legs trembled under the effort, but there was a new determination in her movements. Atlas sat up slowly, watching her carefully. He knew this was a good sign, her strength was returning. But it also meant something else. She was no longer helpless. The more she recovered, the more dangerous she became. He had spent days close to her, building a fragile understanding, but she was still a wild animal. Instincts didn't just disappear. She met his gaze, her golden eyes alert and focused. This was different from before. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was aware. Atlas grabbed the bowl of water and slid it toward her like he had done every day. This time, she moved toward it with more confidence. She drank deeply, licking her lips when she finished. A chill ran down his spine. He knew what that meant. She wasn't just drinking because she was dehydrated. She was preparing for something else. She was getting hungry. A new problem. Atlas stood and walked to his supply stash. He had been feeding her small amounts of dried meat, just enough to keep her alive. But now that wouldn't be enough. She needed real food, fresh meat. And that was a problem. His outpost wasn't stocked with large quantities of meat, and the nearest town was too far. He needed a solution fast. Then he heard something in the distance. A howl. He turned toward the window, scanning the darkness outside. Another howl followed, then a series of eerie laughs. Hyenas. His mind raced. Hyenas meant one thing: there was a fresh kill somewhere nearby. If he could find it, he could take some of the meat before the scavengers stripped it clean. It was risky, but it was his best option. He grabbed his flashlight, his hunting knife, and a rifle he hoped he wouldn't have to use. Before stepping outside, he glanced back at the lioness. She was still watching him, her eyes steady and unblinking. Something in her gaze unsettled him. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. Atlas didn't know it yet, but when he returned, nothing would ever be the same. Atlas moved cautiously through the darkness, following the eerie sounds of hyenas echoing across the savanna. He gripped his flashlight tightly, the rifle slung over his shoulder more for protection than intent to use it. The air smelled of dry grass and something metallic. Blood. His pulse quickened. If the hyenas had found a fresh kill, he needed to reach it before they stripped it bare. As he crested a small hill, the beam of his flashlight caught movement ahead. 6 hyenas circled a carcass beneath an acacia tree, their eyes glowing in the night. The ribs of the dead animal were still intact. There was enough meat left to help the lioness recover. But the hyenas wouldn't give it up easily. Taking a deep breath, Atlas fired a warning shot into the air. The explosion shattered the silence, and for a brief moment, the scavengers froze before scattering into the tall grass. Wasting no time, Atlas ran to the carcass and pulled out his knife. His hands worked quickly, cutting away as much meat as he could carry. The thick scent of blood filled his nostrils, making his stomach tighten. He knew he had to move fast. Hyenas wouldn't stay gone for long, and worse, something bigger might be watching. Just as he slung the cloth bag of meat over his shoulder, a deep, rumbling growl stopped him cold. Slowly, he turned his flashlight toward the sound. 2 glowing amber eyes stared back at him from the darkness. A lion. Not his lioness. This was a male, its thick mane barely visible in the dim light. Stood motionless, powerful, watching. Atlas held his breath, knowing that in the lion's mind, he was trespassing. If he made the wrong move, this encounter could end very differently. Keeping his movements slow, Atlas took a careful step back. The lion didn't charge, but its muscles were tense. Ready. Another step. Another. Then, just as Atlas reached the edge of the clearing, the lion let out a low, guttural growl, a warning. Heart pounding, Atlas turned and walked away, forcing himself not to run. Running would trigger the chase. Running would turn him from an intruder into prey. Only when he reached the cabin did he finally exhale, his hands shaking from the tension. He had the meat. He had survived. But something about the way that lion had watched him left him unsettled. It wasn't just hunger or territorial aggression. It was something else. As he stepped inside, his thoughts turned back to the lioness resting in the corner. He had saved her life once. But what if, in doing so, he had upset the balance of something far greater? Atlas stepped into the cabin, closing the door behind him with a quiet but deliberate motion. The lioness was awake, her golden eyes locking onto him immediately. She sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring at the scent of fresh meat. There was something different about her now. Her gaze was more focused, more alive. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was regaining herself. Carefully, Atlas unwrapped the meat and placed a portion on the floor before stepping back. The lioness remained still for a moment, her ears twitching slightly, assessing the situation. Then, in one smooth motion, she dragged the food closer with her paw and tore into it. Her jaws worked with renewed strength, and Atlas could hear the wet sound of muscle and sinew breaking apart. It was the most she had eaten since he found her. He watched in silence, his mind racing. This was progress, she was getting stronger. But it also meant she was returning to what she truly was. The more she recovered, the closer he got to the moment when she wouldn't need him anymore. Maybe even the moment she would stop seeing him as something separate from prey. The thought made his stomach tighten, but he pushed it aside. She wasn't just any lioness. Something about her was different. After finishing the meat, she licked her lips and turned her gaze back to him. It wasn't a look of hunger, nor was it aggression. It was something in between, an acknowledgement, a silent understanding. Atlas felt a strange pull in his chest. He had studied lions for years, but never like this. Never this close. He wasn't sure if he was taming her, or if she was taming him. Night passed slowly, with Atlas keeping his distance while she rested. Occasionally, she would shift, stretching her recovering muscles, testing her own strength. The change was happening faster than he had expected. Soon she would be ready to stand. Soon she would want more than just food. She would want freedom. But was she ready for the wild again? Or had something about her changed too? Just before dawn, a sound outside made Atlas stiffen. A low, distant roar. Not from her, this was something else. The male lion. The one he had encountered near the hyena kill. Atlas knew enough to understand the meaning behind it. It wasn't just a territorial call. It was a claim, a warning. The balance of the savanna had shifted, and he was now caught in the middle of something far bigger than he had realized. He glanced back at the lioness. She was still resting, her breathing steady, but her ears twitched in response to the sound. She had heard it too, and deep down, Atlas knew her instincts would soon force her to make a choice. And when that moment came, he had no idea what she would decide. The first rays of sunlight crept through the small window of the cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Atlas sat near the doorway, gripping a mug of lukewarm coffee, but his focus wasn't on the drink. His eyes remained on the lioness, who lay just a few feet away. Something about her had changed overnight. She was stronger now. He could see it in the way she held herself, the way her breathing was deeper, steadier, the way her eyes no longer held the fog of weakness but instead burned with something far more primal. She wasn't just recovering anymore. She was preparing. Outside, the savanna stirred with life. Birds called from the trees, and in the distance, the deep, rumbling roar of the male lion echoed once again. This time, the lioness reacted immediately. Her ears perked up, and for the first time since he had rescued her, she rose onto all four legs. Atlas set his mug down slowly, his breath catching in his throat. She stood there, her body lean but solid, her muscles tense beneath her golden coat. It was as if a switch had flipped inside her. For days, she had been weak, helpless. But now, she was something else entirely, something wild. She took a slow step toward the door, then another, her gaze locked on the open land beyond the cabin. Atlas could feel it. Her instincts were pulling her back to where she belonged. This was the moment he had been waiting for, yet somehow he wasn't ready. He swallowed hard and stood up, moving carefully so as not to startle her. "You're ready, aren't you?" he said softly. The lioness turned her head slightly, her amber eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them, no aggression, just understanding. Atlas took a deep breath, stepping toward the door. Slowly, he pushed it open, revealing the vastness of the savanna stretching beyond the fence. The wind carried the scent of the wild, of freedom. The lioness took another step forward, then hesitated. For the first time, she looked back at him. It was only for a second, But that second held something Atlas couldn't quite explain. Connection. A moment of recognition between two beings who had saved each other in ways neither of them could fully comprehend. Then, without another glance, she stepped forward and walked out into the open. Atlas followed her as far as the fence, watching as she moved with new strength, her head high, her steps sure. She didn't run. She didn't rush. She simply reclaimed the land that had once been hers. But she wasn't alone. In the distance, the figure of the male lion appeared from behind the tall grass. He stood still, waiting, his massive frame outlined against the rising sun. The lioness paused, her body tense. A moment of silent communication passed between them, one only they could understand. Then, with deliberate steps, she moved toward him. Atlas felt his chest tighten. This was it. She was going back. She had survived. She had healed. And now, she was answering the call that had always been inside her. But what he didn't know was that fate wasn't done with them yet. Because before she disappeared into the wild, she would make one final choice. Atlas stood at the edge of the fence, watching as the lioness walked toward the male lion. The golden light of dawn bathed them both, highlighting the raw power and grace in their movements. The male remained still, his massive frame exuding dominance, but there was no aggression in his stance. This was a moment of instinct, a test, a decision. The lioness hesitated just a few steps away from him. She had spent days in the cabin, growing stronger under Atlas's care, but now she was at a crossroads. The wild was calling her back, yet something held her in place. She turned her head, looking back at the cabin. Looking back at him, Atlas felt his breath catch. For a brief second, the world stood still. He wasn't sure what he expected. She was a wild animal, not a pet. But deep inside, he realized he had been waiting for this moment. Waiting to see if what they had built, however fragile, had meant something to her too. The male lion let out a deep, rumbling sound, a low but commanding call. The lioness blinked, her ears twitching. Then, with quiet resolve, she turned and walked toward him. Atlas swallowed the lump in his throat as he watched them disappear into the tall grass, their golden coats blending into the endless savanna. She was gone. A strange emptiness settled in his chest. He had known from the start that this was temporary, that she didn't belong in the world of men. Still, seeing her leave stirred something in him. Pride, loss, and something he couldn't quite name. With a deep sigh, he turned to head back inside. But just as he reached the door, a rustling in the grass made him freeze. He turned back, his heart pounding. And there she was. The lioness stood just beyond the fence, her eyes locked onto his. She didn't step forward, didn't move closer, but she was there watching him. Atlas felt his throat tighten. This wasn't hesitation. It wasn't uncertainty. It was a choice. She had answered the call of the wild, but she hadn't forgotten him. For several long moments, they stood there, two creatures from different worlds sharing something unspoken. Then, slowly, with the grace of a queen reclaiming her kingdom, she turned one last time and disappeared into the wild for good. Atlas exhaled, a slow smile forming on his lips. Some bonds couldn't be explained. Some stories didn't need perfect endings. Because in the heart of the African savanna, a man had saved a lioness. And, in her own way, she had saved him too.